There are 15 surnames in China that were never supposed to survive intact. Dynasties fell. Armies burned records. Entire lineages were erased by famine, war, and forced migration across more than 3,000 years of upheaval. And yet these 15 names persisted, carried from father to son, generation after generation, long after the empires that once elevated them had turned to dust. For centuries, the families who carried these names believed they understood exactly what that survival meant. A direct line. An unbroken thread back to a founding ancestor, sometimes a nobleman, sometimes a general, sometimes, according to family record, an emperor himself. Then geneticists opened the Y chromosome. What they found did not simply confirm centuries of careful genealogy. It did something more unsettling. It suggested that some of the most celebrated surname lineages in Chinese history are not single threads at all, but braided cords, multiple, unrelated paternal lines quietly sharing one name, one legend, and one claimed ancestor who may never have existed for most of the people now honoring him. The official story was elegant. The DNA was not obligated to agree with it. For most of recorded history, Chinese surnames functioned as something close to sacred record-keeping. Passed exclusively through the paternal line, documented in clan genealogies called zupu that some families maintained continuously for over 1,000 years, surnames were treated as living archives, proof of descent from a specific founding figure, often tied to a noble house, a meritorious official, or in the most prestigious cases, an imperial bloodline. This system made sense within its own logic. Written genealogies were carefully guarded. Clan temples preserved ancestral tablets. Marriage records, imperial examinations, and land inheritance all depended on proving legitimate descent. If your family said you descended from a Tang dynasty general, and the zupu going back 30 generations said the same thing, there was little reason for anyone, including historians, to doubt it. The paper trail was long, consistent, and culturally sacred. But paper is not the same as biology. And the first cracks did not come from a laboratory. They came from the genealogies themselves. Historians studying clan records noticed something strange happening in certain surname lineages, particularly in regions that had experienced repeated waves of famine, war, and mass resettlement. Genealogies would show suspicious gaps, generations skipped, founding ancestors reassigned, entire branches grafted onto a more prestigious family tree centuries after the fact. In some documented cases, families facing extinction of their male line adopted sons from unrelated families specifically to preserve the surname and the ancestral rights tied to it. The name continued. The bloodline, in some branches, quietly did not. This was not proof of anything on a large scale. It was a whisper, evidence that at least some surname lines had absorbed outsiders at some point in their history. The real question was how common this actually was, and whether it was isolated to a few unlucky families or something built into the structure of the system itself. That question could not be answered by paper records alone. It required going deeper than any genealogy could reach, into the genome itself. This is where Y chromosome analysis became essential. Passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations, the Y chromosome offered something written records could not. A biological record of paternal descent that did not care what a genealogy claimed, only what had actually been inherited. If a surname lineage was truly a single unbroken paternal line, the men who carried it today should share a relatively recent common Y chromosome ancestor. A lineage that geneticists can date, cluster, and compare across thousands of samples. Researchers began comparing Y chromosome data from men sharing the same surname across different regions of China, testing whether genealogical claims of common descent matched the biological evidence beneath them. If subjects like this hold your attention the way they hold mine, it's worth staying close, because the human past keeps turning out to be stranger than the paperwork ever admitted. What the data revealed was not a simple validation. It was not a simple debunking either. It was something far more layered than either outcome. For several surnames, especially those tracing back to well-documented noble lineages from the Han and Tang dynasties, the Y chromosome data showed a striking pattern. A large percentage of men carrying the surname clustered around the same paternal lineage, with a common ancestor dating to roughly the historical period the genealogy claimed. In these cases, remarkably, the paper trail and the biological trail agreed. But in other surnames, including some of the most numerically common names in China today, the picture fractured completely. Instead of one dominant lineage, researchers found several distinct, unrelated Y chromosome clusters, each carrying the same surname, each with genealogies claiming descent from the same founding ancestor. Statistically, these lineages could not all be biologically related. The name was shared. The blood, in large part, was not. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. It suggested that surnames in China had never functioned as pure biological records at all. Not entirely. They had functioned as social and legal institutions, absorbing outsiders through adoption, through sons-in-law taking on a wife's family name to continue a lineage, through entire communities adopting a prestigious surname during periods of social mobility, and through practices that blurred the line between ancestry and legal inheritance long before anyone thought to question it. The story did not collapse. It widened, and it forced researchers to consider several very different explanations for what the genome was actually showing. The first explanation is the most straightforward: multiple independent founding events. Rather than one man founding a surname lineage, several unrelated men in different regions may have independently adopted or been granted the same surname, through imperial decree, geographic naming conventions, or clan reorganization, centuries before written genealogies began recording a single unified ancestor. The second explanation involves adoption and social absorption on a scale far larger than most families realized. Throughout Chinese history, adopting a son to continue a family line was not rare. It was a recognized, socially accepted practice, particularly for families without biological male heirs. Multiply that practice across 1,000 years and thousands of families, and an originally narrow lineage could statistically absorb dozens of unrelated paternal lines while the surname itself remained perfectly continuous on paper. The third explanation is the most historically dramatic: political and social elevation events, where entire non-related clans adopted a powerful surname during moments of upheaval, dynastic collapse, mass migration, or imperial reward, deliberately attaching themselves to a prestigious name to gain social standing, legal protection, or access to ancestral privileges tied to that lineage. No single explanation accounts for all 15 surnames studied. Different names carry different histories, and the genome does not flatten that complexity, it reveals it. The turning point came with a wave of larger-scale genomic research comparing thousands of Y chromosome samples across dozens of Chinese surnames, cross-referenced against regional genealogical records spanning multiple dynasties. This was decisive in a way earlier, smaller studies could not be, simply because of scale, enough samples across enough regions to distinguish a true single-founder lineage from a name that had absorbed outside lines repeatedly over centuries. The key finding reshaped how researchers understood surname inheritance across Chinese history. Genetic diversity within a single surname correlated closely with that surname's historical prestige and population size. The more socially valuable a name became, tied to nobility, imperial favor, or clan power, the more likely it was, over centuries, to have been adopted, absorbed, or claimed by unrelated lineages seeking its benefits. Prestige, it turned out, was not just inherited. It was, in a genetic sense, contagious. And this is where the twist reshaped everything. Not a single unbroken imperial bloodline. Not even close, for several of the most storied names in Chinese history. For a handful of surnames long associated with specific imperial houses, Y chromosome data revealed that the modern population carrying the name traced back not to one emperor, but to a scattering of distinct paternal lineages, some genuinely ancient and consistent with the claimed dynasty, others dating no earlier than a few hundred years, suggesting far later adoption of the name by families seeking its prestige. In one particularly striking case, researchers found that a surname widely believed to descend from a single legendary founding figure actually clustered into several major, unrelated Y chromosome haplogroups, meaning that for a majority of modern bearers, the shared ancestor at the root of their family genealogy was, biologically, not shared at all. The genome was not erasing the old story. It was revealing an older, more complicated one beneath it, one where identity had always been as much a social choice as a biological inheritance. This matters far beyond 15 surnames. Because what it suggests is that ancestry, even in a culture that documented paternal lineage as carefully and reverently as any in human history, was never as pure or as singular as the written record implied. Names carried forward power, obligation, and belonging, but blood did not always move in lockstep beneath them. Populations we assume to be genetically continuous across millennia are, more often than not, composites, built from repeated moments of adoption, absorption, and social reinvention that written history rarely bothered to record honestly. This is not a story about deception. It is a story about how human societies actually work, how identity, across every culture on Earth, has always been negotiated as much as inherited. Picture a clan temple in a quiet mountain village in southern China, its wooden beams darkened by centuries of incense smoke. Ancestral tablets line the walls, each one inscribed with a name, a title, a place in a genealogy that stretches back, on paper, more than 40 generations. An old man lights incense before the tablet of a Song dynasty official, the man his family has always called their founding ancestor. He does not know, and may never need to know, whether the DNA in his own cells actually traces back to that specific man, or to one of several unrelated lines that, centuries ago, quietly took on the same revered name. Either way, the incense burns. The name endures. The devotion is real, whatever the genome eventually reveals. What the DNA shows, in the end, is not a smaller history. It is a larger, more human one, where surnames functioned less like biological fingerprints and more like living institutions, flexible enough to absorb outsiders, resilient enough to survive collapse, and powerful enough that people across thousands of years chose, again and again, to attach their futures to a name that promised connection to something greater than themselves. The old story imagined a single thread, pulled taut and unbroken across 3,000 years. The genome reveals something closer to a river, fed by many sources, merging and splitting and merging again, carrying forward a name even as the water within it constantly changed. The map of Chinese ancestry, like every human ancestry map before it, remains incomplete. But each new genome recovered from this vast, layered lineage adds another thread to a picture richer and more surprising than any single family record could ever have preserved alone. Proof that even the names we think we know best still have histories waiting to be uncovered. If stories like this fascinate you, let me know in the comments which surname or which lineage deserves to be traced next.